The Invisible Architect. How narcissistic siblings quietly shape the family system. There are families that look perfectly normal from the outside. They gather for holidays. They laugh in photos. They say things like, "We're close," and "Family is everything." But inside those families, there is often one person everyone is unconsciously watching. One person whose mood determines whether dinner will be peaceful or explosive. One person whose reactions decide which topics are safe and which truths must stay buried. One person who never needed a title, authority, or permission to quietly become the center of gravity. And most of the time, that person is not a parent. It's a sibling. If you grew up in a family where tension appeared out of nowhere, where silence felt safer than honesty, where you learned early to read the room before speaking, this story may feel uncomfortably familiar. Because in families shaped by a narcissistic sibling, nothing is random. The emotional climate is engineered, and it usually happens so quietly that no one notices it until years or decades later. Here's the shocking part. Many people grow up believing they were the problem. Too sensitive, too reactive, too emotional, too difficult. But what if the family system itself was quietly reorganized around one sibling's need for control, validation, and dominance? What if the rules of your family were never spoken aloud, only enforced? This is how narcissistic siblings become the invisible architects of family dynamics. Not through screaming fits or obvious cruelty, though those can happen, but through repetition, through subtle conditioning, through the slow training of everyone else to adapt. At first, it looks like normal sibling rivalry. They're competitive, strong-willed, confident, maybe even charismatic. Adults often brush it off with a smile. That's just their personality. Inexpansion. And an expansion. Entendidé. Credididae. Constempted. Grossed. They're competitive. But healthy rivalry has repair. It has moments of mutual respect, accountability, and growth. Narcissistic dominance does not. Instead, something else begins to form an unspoken hierarchy. One sibling's emotions start to matter more than everyone else's. Their anger feels dangerous. Their disappointment feels catastrophic. Their approval feels rare and intoxicating. So, the family adapts. Conversations are softened. Disagreements are postponed. Truth is filtered. And the most empathetic person in the family, often without realizing it, becomes the emotional shock absorber. They learn to soothe. They learn to explain. They learn to bend. Over time, the family stops asking, "Is this fair?" They start asking a quieter, more dangerous question. Will this upset them? That question becomes the organizing principle of the household. This is where the damage begins. Because when one sibling is allowed to dominate the emotional space, everyone else must shrink to survive. Needs become negotiable. Boundaries feel selfish. Speaking up feels risky. And here's the part no one prepares you for. The narcissistic sibling doesn't have to look like a villain. In fact, they often don't. They may be successful, charming, generous, when it benefits them. To outsiders, they appear reasonable, even admirable. Inside the family, however, their presence creates a quiet pressure that never lifts. You learn to anticipate them, their tone, their silences, their subtle punishments. You may not even realize you're doing it until one day. You notice how tense your body feels around them, how your voice changes, how carefully you choose your words. That's not coincidence. That's conditioning. And what makes this especially destabilizing is that the family rarely names it. There's no meeting, no acknowledgement, no moment where someone says, "This isn't healthy." Instead, the system protects itself. The sibling who causes the most disruption is quietly protected from accountability because confronting them feels too hard, too explosive, too inconvenient. So the responsibility shifts. The calm sibling must stay calm. The honest sibling must soften the truth. The hurt sibling must forgive faster. This is how narcissistic siblings don't just exist within a family system, they become the system. Years later, as adults, many survivors look back and realize something unsettling. They were never allowed to be fully themselves. Their role was not to be authentic. Their role was to stabilize the family. And if you're wondering why this hurts so deeply, it's because sibling relationships are not casual. They are formative. They shape how we understand fairness, belonging, and safety. When that relationship is distorted by narcissism, it doesn't just affect childhood, it rewires identity. But here's the truth most people never hear. If you grew up constantly adjusting yourself to keep the peace, if you learned early that harmony mattered more than honesty, if you were told, directly or indirectly, that you were the problem for noticing something was wrong, you were not imagining it. You were living inside a system quietly shaped by someone who needed to be central at all costs. And this is only the beginning of the story. In the next parts, we're going to explore how these dynamics start in childhood, how they evolve in adulthood, why the grief is so profound, and most importantly, how people begin to reclaim their lives from systems that were never built to protect them. But before we continue, if this resonates with you, and you want more deep, honest conversations about narcissistic family dynamics, trauma, and healing, please subscribe to the channel. Your support makes it possible to keep creating content that tells the stories most people are afraid to name. Now, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Quick question for you. Which feels closer to your experience? A. You grew up constantly monitoring one sibling's emotions to keep the family stable. B. You were labeled the difficult one for reacting to behavior no one else wanted to address. Comment A or B below. Your answer matters, and you are not alone. Childhood is not neutral. How narcissistic patterns begin early. Childhood is often described as innocent, forgiving, and flexible, as if time itself automatically smooths over whatever happens there. But for many people, childhood was not a blank slate. It was a training ground. And when narcissistic patterns are present early, childhood becomes the place where silence is learned, roles are assigned, and reality is quietly rewritten. What makes this especially difficult to grasp is that no one ever sits a child down and explains what is happening. There is no announcement, no clear villain, no obvious abuse that adults rush to stop. Instead, the dynamics unfold slowly, almost invisibly, woven into daily routines, family jokes, and small, repeated moments that don't seem important at the time. In the family Mark and Emily grew up in outside Boston, nothing looked alarming on the surface. There was food on the table. School events were attended. Holidays happened like clockwork. Yet beneath the structure, something subtle was already taking shape. Mark was intense even as a young child. He demanded attention, struggled with frustration, and reacted strongly to disappointment. Adults often described him as a lot, but brilliant, or difficult, but special. Emily, younger, and more emotionally attuned, learned early that Mark's mood set the tone of the household. When he was calm, the house felt lighter. When he was upset, everything tightened. This is how narcissistic patterns often begin, not with cruelty, but with emotional imbalance. Children are not born narcissists. Personality is still forming well into adulthood. But certain traits, when reinforced rather than guided, can harden into patterns. A child who consistently needs to be the center of attention, who struggles with empathy, who feels entitled to priority, and who reacts aggressively to perceived competition, is not doomed, but they are at risk. When those traits are met with accommodation instead of correction, they become strategy. The arrival of a younger sibling is often the first real test. Babies demand attention by design. For a child already oriented around being central, This can feel like displacement. In healthy families, parents help children process this transition, acknowledging jealousy, reinforcing safety, modeling empathy. But when parents are overwhelmed, conflict avoidant, or unconsciously impressed by the more dominant child, something else happens. The older child learns that acting out works. In Mark's case, subtle behaviors began to appear. He interrupted Emily when she spoke. He corrected her stories. He framed himself as misunderstood and her as annoying. When conflicts arose, his version of events was delivered with confidence and emotional force. Emily's responses were quieter, less certain. Adults believed the louder story. No one thought of this as abuse. It was called sibling rivalry. It was minimized, normalized. But rivalry implies mutual power. What was forming instead was hierarchy. Over time, Emily learned that expressing hurt made things worse. Mark became more agitated. Parents became stressed. The fastest way back to peace was her silence. So she adapted. She learned to be easy. She learned to give in. She learned to anticipate. This is how children internalize roles. The narcissistically oriented child learns entitlement without consequence. The empathic child learns responsibility without protection. Neither child is consciously choosing this. They are responding to the system they are in. One of the most damaging elements of these early dynamics is how reality itself becomes unstable. When a child repeatedly experiences their perception being dismissed, "You're overreacting. That's not what happened. You're too sensitive." They begin to doubt their inner signals. Trust in the self erodes quietly. For Emily, this meant learning to scan faces before speaking. It meant asking herself, "Is this worth it?" before expressing a need. It meant carrying guilt she couldn't explain. These patterns don't happen in isolation. Parents play a role, even when they mean well. Some parents prioritize harmony over truth. Others unconsciously side with the child who feels more powerful or emotionally demanding. In some cases, a parent may have narcissistic traits themselves, further reinforcing the imbalance. But even without malicious intent, the outcome is the same. One child's emotional needs dominate the family space. What makes this especially insidious is that moments of kindness still exist. There are good days. There are shared laughs. There are memories that confuse the narrative. Survivors often question themselves later because it wasn't all bad. But trauma is not defined by constant pain. It is defined by inconsistency without safety. Another key element that often forms in childhood is trauma bonding between siblings. Younger or more empathic children often continue seeking closeness with the sibling who hurts them. They hope for approval. They believe that if they just behave correctly, the relationship will become safe. This hope is not weakness. It is attachment. Children are wired to bond with those they grow up with. When that bond is mixed with fear, unpredictability, and intermittent kindness, it becomes deeply entrenched. The child learns to endure rather than exit. By the time adulthood arrives, the roles feel natural, invisible. This is just how it's always been. But childhood was not neutral. It was the place where the rules were written. Who gets believed? Who must adapt a film? Who carries the emotional labor? Who is allowed to take up space? And unless those rules are consciously examined later, they will continue to run the system long after the children grow up. Understanding this is not about blaming parents or demonizing siblings. It is about clarity. About recognizing that what feels personal now was patterned long ago. Because healing does not begin with confrontation. It begins with understanding that the ground you were standing on as a child was already tilted, and you were never meant to keep your balance alone. Adulthood fallout. How narcissistic siblings redefine loyalty, love, and truth. Adulthood is supposed to be the great equalizer. Distance from childhood. Independence. Perspective. Many people quietly carry the belief that once everyone grows up, the old dynamics will soften. That maturity will correct what time could not. That siblings, now adults, will finally meet each other as equals. For those who grew up with a narcissistic sibling, this hope is often the last illusion to fall. For Emily, adulthood did not bring relief, it brought clarity. And clarity can be far more painful than confusion. On the surface, Mark looked like he had matured. He was articulate, composed, and socially adept. In family gatherings, he was often the calmest voice in the room. He spoke about responsibility, loyalty, and keeping the family together. Outsiders admired his steadiness. Even extended family members described him as reasonable. But beneath that surface, the same childhood patterns were still running. Only now, they were harder to detect and far more destabilizing. As adults, narcissistic siblings rarely rely on overt aggression. Instead, they redefine the emotional rules of the family, using language that sounds healthy, mature, even moral. Words like loyalty, love, and family become tools not to connect, but to control. For Mark, loyalty meant compliance. Love meant not challenging him. Truth meant the version of events that made him look reasonable. And Emily didn't realize how deeply this had shaped her until she tried to change the pattern. It started small. A boundary here. A pause there. Emily stopped immediately, smoothing things over when Mark became irritated. She spoke up gently when something felt unfair. She assumed naively that adulthood allowed for honest conversation. What she didn't expect was how quickly the family system reacted. Mark didn't explode. He didn't insult her. He did something far more effective. He stayed calm. He expressed concern about Emily's distance. He wondered aloud why she seemed so angry lately. He framed her boundaries as rejection, her clarity as cruelty. And because he sounded measured, his narrative carried weight. Emily, meanwhile, was emotional. Not because she was irrational, but because she was finally responding to years of accumulated pressure. In the family's eyes, this contrast was all the evidence they needed. This is how narcissistic siblings win in adulthood. Not by being right, but by appearing regulated while others are unraveling. Triangulation becomes the central strategy. Mark maintained contact with everyone. He checked in. He showed up. He gathered quiet support. Emily, trying to protect herself, pulled back. The story practically wrote itself. She's changed. She's difficult now. She's creating division. In families shaped by narcissistic siblings, the person who names the problem often becomes the problem. This is especially true when practical issues arise: money, caregiving, decision-making. These moments expose power dynamics that were once emotional and now become material. When their parents began needing more support, Emily naturally stepped in. Doctor appointments, paperwork, daily logistics. Mark had opinions, but little availability. Yet he expected to be consulted, deferred to, and ultimately obeyed. When Emily asked for shared responsibility, the conversation didn't center on fairness. It centered on her tone, her approach, her resentment. This is one of the most devastating adult realizations for survivors. The work will fall to you, but the authority will not. And if you resist this arrangement, you are labeled ungrateful. American culture makes this even harder. The moral weight placed on family loyalty is immense. Phrases like, "You'll regret this one day," or "blood is thicker than water," are often weaponized against the sibling who refuses to continue absorbing harm. Emily felt this pressure acutely. Every boundary came with guilt. Every moment of self-protection was framed as betrayal. The message was clear. Maintaining the illusion of family harmony mattered more than her psychological safety. What makes narcissistic sibling dynamics in adulthood so uniquely painful is that they distort love itself. Love becomes endurance. Care becomes self-sacrifice. Forgiveness becomes erasure. and truth becomes dangerous, because the truth threatens the system. As Emily grew more aware, she noticed something else. Mark's version of their shared history was shifting. He remembered himself as protective, generous, patient. Any harm was minimized, reframed, or erased entirely. When Emily recalled moments of fear or humiliation, Mark dismissed them as exaggerations. When she tried to explain how those experiences shaped her, he accused her of living in the past. This is where many survivors begin to feel unmoored. Siblings are meant to be shared witnesses. They are supposed to hold overlapping memories that ground us in reality. When that witness becomes unreliable or actively distorts the past, it creates a profound sense of disorientation. Emily began questioning herself again. Was it really that bad? Am I being unfair? This internal conflict is not accidental. It is the residue of long-term gaslighting, compounded by adult power dynamics. Eventually, Emily reached a painful understanding. The relationship she wanted with Mark required her silence, her compliance, her disappearance, and that realization carried grief. Grief for the sibling relationship she never had. Grief for the family she kept trying to earn. Grief for the version of adulthood she hoped would finally feel free. Choosing herself did not bring instant peace. It brought loneliness. It brought misunderstanding. Some family members pulled away. Others urged reconciliation without accountability. But something else began to grow quietly beneath the loss. Clarity. Emily stopped arguing with Mark's narrative. She stopped defending herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. She accepted a hard truth. Not everyone is willing to see what threatens their comfort. Adulthood did not fix the damage, but it did offer a choice. To continue sacrificing herself for a system that required her pain to function, or to step out of it and begin building a life that did not revolve around someone else's emotional gravity. That choice is not easy. It is not celebrated. And it is rarely understood. But it is real. And for many survivors of narcissistic sibling dynamics, it is the first truly adult decision they ever get to make. The psychological cost, identity, grief, and the loss no one talks about. The deepest damage caused by a narcissistic sibling is rarely visible from the outside. It doesn't announce itself through dramatic scenes or obvious cruelty. Instead, it settles quietly into the inner world of the sibling, who learned over years to bend, adjust, and disappear in order to survive. By adulthood, the harm is no longer just relational. It is psychological, existential. It lives in the way a person understands themselves, interprets reality, and measures their own worth. For Emily, the cost did not show up as a single breaking point. It showed up as a pattern, a constant undercurrent of self-doubt, an instinct to explain herself, even when she had done nothing wrong. A feeling that her emotions were always slightly excessive, her needs slightly unreasonable, her presence slightly inconvenient. She did not grow up thinking, "My brother harmed me." She grew up thinking, "Something is wrong with me." This is one of the most devastating outcomes of narcissistic sibling dynamics: identity erosion. When a child spends years having their perceptions minimized or contradicted, they begin to mistrust their internal compass. If Mark dismissed Emily's memories, reframed conflicts, or portrayed himself as reasonable while subtly implying she was unstable, those messages didn't disappear when childhood ended. They became internalized. Emily learned to interrogate her own reactions before trusting them. Am I being dramatic? Did I misunderstand? Am I overreacting again? Over time, this inner questioning became automatic. It followed her into friendships, romantic relationships, and work environments. Even in spaces where Mark was not present, his voice lingered, an internal critic shaped by years of emotional invalidation. This is how narcissistic sibling abuse becomes self-perpetuating. The sibling no longer needs to be in the room. The doubt has already taken root. But identity damage is only part of the story. There is also grief, a particular kind of grief that society rarely names, let alone validates. People understand grief when someone dies. They understand it when a marriage ends. But the grief of realizing you never truly had a sibling, despite sharing a childhood, a home, a history, is far more complicated. Emily grieved someone who was still alive. She grieved the idea of a sibling who might have protected her, celebrated her, or simply been safe. She grieved the shared memories that felt tainted, unreliable, or weaponized. She grieved the loss of a witness to her own childhood, someone who should have been able to say, "Yes, that really happened." Instead, Mark became the distorter of her history. In healthy sibling relationships, shared memory creates grounding. It offers continuity. When one sibling remembers an event differently, there is usually curiosity, dialogue, repair. In narcissistic dynamics, memory becomes a battleground. Mark remembered himself as generous, patient, protective. Any harm was minimized or erased. Emily's pain was reframed as sensitivity, her fear as exaggeration, her recollections as attacks. This left Emily in a profoundly destabilizing position. If the person who shared her childhood denied her reality, what did that say about her own mind? This is where grief turns inward. Survivors often mourn not just the sibling they never had, but the version of themselves that might have existed in a different system. A self who trusted her instincts, a self who spoke freely, a self who did not feel responsible for everyone else's emotional state. There is also the grief of isolation, because when Emily tried to articulate this loss, she was often met with confusion or worse, dismissal. "But he's your brother. All siblings fight. You'll regret distancing yourself." These statements may sound harmless, even caring, but they compound the harm. They communicate that Emily's pain is less important than the preservation of a comforting narrative about family. This is what makes narcissistic sibling grief so lonely. It is rarely witnessed. And then there is the double bind. To stay connected to the family often means continuing to accept Mark's version of reality. It means staying quiet, agreeable, and emotionally flexible. To step away means being misunderstood, judged, or cast as the disruptor. Neither option feels like winning. Many survivors describe this as a fundamental loss of belonging. Not just to a sibling, but to a family identity they were raised to believe in. Choosing psychological safety can feel like choosing exile. Over time, this tension takes a toll on the nervous system. Chronic hypervigilance, emotional exhaustion, difficulty resting, difficulty trusting closeness. These are not character flaws, they are adaptive responses to long-term relational threat. Emily noticed how her body reacted before her mind caught up. Tightness in her chest before family gatherings, fatigue after brief interactions, a sense of dread she couldn't logically explain. Her body remembered what her mind was still learning to accept. Healing did not come from confrontation. It came from naming the loss. Naming that she had been shaped by an environment where her needs were secondary. Naming that she had been grieving something invisible. Naming that it made sense she felt untethered at times because her emotional anchor had always been unstable. This recognition did not erase the pain, but it softened the self-blame. For the first time, Emily began to see her coping strategies not as failures, but as evidence of resilience. Her sensitivity was not weakness, it was awareness. Her caution was not cowardice, it was survival. The psychological cost of narcissistic sibling dynamics is high. It can take years to untangle what was internalized from what was imposed. But understanding the nature of the loss is a turning point. Because grief, once acknowledged, becomes something that can move. And identity, once reclaimed, no longer has to be built in opposition to someone else's dominance. Emily did not regain a sibling. She did not regain a family narrative that included her fully. But she did regain herself. And for many survivors, that is where real healing begins, not with resolution, but with the quiet, radical decision to believe their own experience at last. Rewriting the system, healing, boundaries, and a new definition of family. Healing from a narcissistic sibling relationship does not begin with confrontation, forgiveness, or reconciliation. It begins with a quieter, more unsettling realization. The family system you grew up in was never designed to protect you. It was designed to stabilize itself. And once you see that clearly, you are faced with a question that has no easy answer. Who do you become when you stop playing the role you were trained to play? For Emily, this question arrived slowly. There was no dramatic rupture, no single moment of clarity that changed everything overnight. Instead, there was exhaustion, a deep, bone-level tiredness from years of explaining herself, regulating others' emotions, and absorbing blame that never belonged to her. She did not wake up one day determined to rewrite the system. She woke up one day unable to keep participating in it. This is often how healing begins, not with strength, but with limits. For much of her life, Emily believed that being a good person meant trying harder, being more patient, being more understanding, being the bigger person. These beliefs had been reinforced repeatedly, especially when it came to Mark. If there was tension, she was expected to smooth it over. If there was conflict, she was expected to let it go. If she was hurt, she was expected to forgive quickly and quietly. What she did not realize until much later was that these expectations were not neutral virtues. They were survival strategies, shaped by a system that depended on her flexibility to accommodate Mark's rigidity. Healing required something radical. Stopping. Not stopping contact immediately. Not stopping caring, but stopping the reflex to explain, justify, and accommodate. Boundaries, Emily learned, were not conversations. They were decisions. She did not need Mark to understand her boundaries for them to be real. She did not need her family's approval for her limits to be valid. This was one of the hardest lessons to absorb, because she had been conditioned to believe that clarity required consensus. It does not. When Emily began responding differently, shorter answers, fewer explanations, less emotional labor, the system reacted. Confusion surfaced first. Then, discomfort. Then subtle pressure to return to how things used to be. Mark framed her distance as cruelty. Others framed it as selfishness. The unspoken message was clear. Your role was to absorb. Why aren't you absorbing anymore? This is where many people falter. Not because they are weak, but because the cost of stepping out of a family system is real. It can mean fewer invitations, awkward silences, being misunderstood by people whose opinions once mattered deeply. Healing does not mean these losses don't hurt. It means they stop being decisive. Emily began to understand that boundaries were not about controlling Mark's behavior. They were about reclaiming her own energy. She stopped engaging in circular conversations. She stopped correcting false narratives. She stopped offering access to parts of herself that had always been mishandled. This did not make her cold. It made her clearer. And clarity changed everything. With space came grief, but also relief. For the first time, Emily noticed how much emotional bandwidth she had been spending managing someone else's inner world. Without that constant drain, something unfamiliar emerged. Quiet. In that quiet, she began rebuilding. One of the most profound shifts in healing from narcissistic sibling dynamics is redefining the word family. Not as a blood-based obligation, but as an emotional experience. Safety, reciprocity, choice. Emily began investing more deeply in relationships that did not require self-erasure. Friends who listened without minimizing. A partner who respected her boundaries without negotiation. Communities where she was not defined by an old role. This was not about replacement. It was about restoration. For many survivors, this step carries guilt. Society teaches us that family is immutable, that choosing distance is failure. But what is rarely acknowledged is the cost of staying in systems that demand your silence. Emily did not stop loving her family. She stopped abandoning herself to keep them comfortable. Healing also required a reorientation toward grief. Not the kind that seeks closure, but the kind that allows truth. Emily let herself mourn the sibling relationship she never had. The family dynamic that could not be saved without her sacrifice. The years spent trying to earn something that was never available. Grief did not weaken her, it grounded her. As time passed, something else became possible. Indifference. Not bitterness. Not hatred. Just the absence of emotional charge. Mark's reactions no longer dictated her nervous system. His approval no longer felt necessary. His version of reality no longer felt destabilizing. This was not because Mark changed. It was because Emily did. Healing did not make her fearless. It made her honest. She learned that being the bigger person had often meant being the quieter one. That forgiveness without accountability had been another form of self-betrayal. That peace built on suppression was not peace at all. Rewriting the system did not mean fixing the family. It meant stepping out of a structure that required her to shrink and building a life that allowed her to expand. This process was not linear. There were moments of doubt, moments of loneliness, moments when old guilt resurfaced and asked familiar questions. Was it really that bad? Are you being too harsh? But Emily had learned something essential. Self-trust is built, not granted. Each time she honored her limits, she reinforced a new internal foundation. Each time she chose clarity over appeasement, she reclaimed a piece of herself that had been outsourced to the system. In the end, healing did not look like resolution. There was no final conversation that made everything right. There was no apology that rewrote the past. There was simply a life that felt more aligned. A life where Emily no longer measured her worth by how well she managed Mark's emotions. A life where love did not require endurance. A life where family was defined not by obligation, but by care. Rewriting the system is not about burning bridges. It is about refusing to live on them. And for those who grew up shaped by narcissistic sibling dynamics, that refusal is not selfish. It is the most honest act of self-respect they may ever make. A long reflection. What Emily's story teaches us about family, healing, and self-trust. Emily's story does not end with reconciliation, vindication, or a dramatic confrontation where everything finally makes sense to everyone involved. It ends in a quieter place, a place many survivors eventually reach, often without applause or approval. For most of her life, Emily believed that if she explained herself clearly enough, if she stayed patient long enough, if she loved hard enough, the family system would eventually respond. She believed that maturity would soften old wounds, that loyalty would be reciprocated, and that truth spoken gently would be welcomed. What she discovered instead was sobering. Some family systems are not built on truth, but on stability. And stability often comes at the expense of the most emotionally aware member. Mark did not need to change for the system to keep functioning. Emily did. And when she finally stopped adapting, the system resisted not because she was wrong, but because her growth exposed what had long been hidden. The most painful realization Emily faced was not that her sibling was narcissistic. It was that the love she had been trying to earn required her silence. That belonging came with conditions. That the family's comfort depended on her willingness to doubt herself. This is the moment many people fear, because it forces a choice. Emily chose integrity. From her story, one lesson stands above all others. Healing does not mean fixing your family. It means freeing yourself from roles that cost you your identity. You do not need agreement to be right. You do not need validation to trust your experience. And you do not need to stay in emotional harm to prove that you are loving. Another lesson is this. Boundaries are not punishments, they are acknowledgments of reality. When someone consistently benefits from your flexibility but resists your limits, the problem is not your boundary. It is the system that depended on you having none. For the audience watching or reading this, the application is deeply personal. You may not be ready to set big boundaries. You may not be ready to step back. But you can begin by asking one honest question. Who do I have to be in my family to belong? And what does that cost me? Healing often starts there. Disclaimer: this video is for educational and informational purposes only and does not replace professional diagnosis or psychological treatment from a licensed mental health professional. Quick question for you. Which feels closer to where you are right now? A. You're still trying to earn understanding from people who benefit from misunderstanding you. B. You're beginning to choose self-trust, even if it means being misunderstood. Comment A or B below to share where you are in your journey. And finally, what are your thoughts? Have you experienced similar dynamics with a sibling or within your family system? What helped you see things more clearly, or what are you still struggling with? Share your perspective in the comments so others know they're not alone. If this story resonated with you and you want more thoughtful, honest conversations about narcissistic family dynamics, healing, and reclaiming your life, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps keep this space alive and allows us to continue creating content that names the experiences so many people have lived but rarely been allowed to talk about.